Good morning, everyone. My name's Alan Can. For those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the team that runs the NatureSpot website, and I'm also one of the county recorders for Leicestershire and Rutland for spiders. And this talk's called "Where Have All the Spiders Gone?" And you'll see why it's called that shortly. And it's about one particular species of spider, though I will talk about a few other species as well, and that's this species, the garden spider, Araneus diadematus. When I became one of the county recorders last year, one of the things I did was I spent quite a lot of time looking at the spider records that we've got. And although Leicestershire and Rutland, Vice County 55, is not the most species-rich county in the country, that would be somewhere probably in the south, like Sussex or somewhere like that probably, we still have 361 species, which is about half the total number of species of spider in Britain. But most impressively, we've got a total of about 44,000 records of spiders, all of which have been authenticated. And that goes all the way back to the 1890s. So that's a very good historical record, and very few counties have got records as good as that. Shropshire is the only one I can think of that would rival that. We've got a total of 361 species recorded in the county, and this graph, the big graph, shows the number of records for each species going all the way back to 1890. So there are quite a lot of species down here, for example, that we've only ever had one record of, and then we've got some species that we've got a lot of records of. So if I asked you the question, what's the most frequently occurring spider in Leicestershire and Rutland, I don't know what would pop into your mind. You might well say house spider. That's probably not true anymore, because house spiders have undergone seemingly a decline in numbers. They're under attack from a number of newcomers. And you might say, you might or might not say, the garden spider, the thing that gives you a face full of spider web when you're out in the garden in the autumn, later in the summer, walking along a path, and you get that spider web in your face. That's almost certainly going to be the garden spider. But when we look at the records for the county, actually, the garden spider is only the fourth most frequently occurring record. And I was a bit surprised by that. The reason, because it's a large species, it's quite an obvious species perched on its web. It's quite easy to identify, as we'll talk about. But by far the most frequently occurring spiders, and this is true everywhere in fact, are the money spiders, the linyphiids, these tiny little things which are actually quite difficult to identify. The species that we have more records for than anything else, Tenuiphantes tenuis, doesn't have a common name, but it is literally everywhere. Very difficult to identify. You can stare at it down the microscope for a long period of time, and even then not that simple to identify. And the big spiders, the nursery web spider, very easy to identify, big stripe down the middle of it, quite difficult to confuse it with other species, is only the fifth most frequently recorded. Enoplanafa, another common spider, quite brightly coloured, sometimes called the candy stripe spider, the ninth most commonly recorded, and so on. So the species records are actually dominated by these little tiny money spiders. But I won't be mentioning, even though they're my favourites, I won't be mentioning those anymore today. I'm going to talk about the garden spider, Araneus diadematus. And the reason I'm talking about that is because of this paper, which was published about 3 weeks ago by a group in Switzerland, looking at a very dramatic decline in the numbers of this species. And this paper is online, it's freely available. If you search for the title, you can find it. This is the abstract, the introduction to the paper. And it makes the point that these large orb-weaving spiders rely almost entirely on flying insects for food. They don't generally, they might get the odd woodlouse, but they don't generally catch things that are crawling around. they catch things that fly into their webs. That's why they go to the trouble of building an orb web. Now, over the last 4 or 5 years, there have been quite a large number of studies showing a dramatic decline in insects across Europe in particular, but other parts of the world as well. And there doesn't seem to be one single reason for that. There's a whole series of reasons: pesticide use, habitat loss, urbanization, climate change. They're probably all contributory factors. But as a whole, the outlying or the emerging picture is that insects, and particularly flying insects, have declined dramatically by 70% or more in some very large long-term studies. Now, if you're a spider, that's very bad news because that's your lunch. And this study that I'm going to talk about is interesting because, unlike most of the data that we have about spiders, this is structured data. And by that, I mean that the data was recorded using a very careful protocol, and therefore it's possible to make comparisons both from one location to another and also in terms of time. So the way that they recorded spiders in this study was to use transects. And what they did was they walked a predetermined route of either 500 meters or 1 kilometer, and they recorded all the spiders they saw, all the garden spiders they saw, within 1 meter either side of their route, and from ground level to 2 meters in the air. And that's where you're going to see garden spiders' webs. You don't see them in the tops of trees. They don't build in the tops of trees. That's where you see them, around face height, generally speaking. And what they found was that, compared with records generated using the same method in the 1970s in many of the same locations, there'd been a 100-fold decline in garden spiders, which is very worrying indeed. And they talk about the reasons why that might have occurred, and I'll go on and discuss that. So they also looked at what the spiders in their study were eating, what they were catching. So these graphs are they actually looked at 20 different sites. And this is just 4 of those sites because they're all rather similar. And this is the prey that the spiders were catching at those sites. And you can see that flies, Diptera, make up the largest part of the diet. And that's followed by Homoptera, and Homoptera in this case this is one order of bugs, insects with sucking mouth parts, and in this case we were talking about flying aphids. And then we've got Hymenoptera, bees and wasps, particularly little solitary wasps, non-social wasps, and then so on and so forth, until you get down to the non-flying things, which make up really a very small part of the spider's diet. So these spiders eat flying insects, which is why they build orb webs. And another observation that the authors made is that the webs in their study seem to be very thin and very fragile. And they found that the number of prey items in the web was reduced, and the webs were very fragile. And that is what you see when spiders are starving. If you malnourish spiders in a laboratory, their webs suffer. Because the webs are made of silk, which is protein, the spiders are unable to eat their food, and if it's not there. And so they find it difficult to produce webs, and therefore, of course, you've got some feedback going on. If they can't produce a nice strong web, it's even harder to catch diminishing prey. There is also this study was not just done in Switzerland, and the reason they did it in Switzerland is there is data produced by transect studies from the 1970s that they compared to come up with this figure of 100-fold reduction. But there's also data from Belgium comparing the 2014, and they saw again 10-fold or more reduction in the number of garden spiders from an area from a decade earlier. Now, so we've got two different parts of Europe, really this is something that has not received attention. I think most people would feel that garden spiders are very, very common species. We don't need to worry about them. And yet, based on evidence of 100-fold decline, this is something that would make you red list a species as severely threatened. And yet, so what we seem to be seeing here is a trophic collapse of an ecosystem. We know from the other studies which have been done that the numbers of flying insects are declining, and now we're seeing the predators declining as well. This makes me think very much about Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, DDT, the effect on raptors. That was a different thing, of course, because that was very much a single cause. We stopped using DDT and the raptors recovered in a period of time. This is much more complex. There are multiple causes here: climate change, habitat loss. For example, the authors of this study point out that there were some sites in the 1977 study that they were comparing their data with that were no longer available because they were fields in 1977 and now they have been built up. There are buildings all over them, so those sites have been lost. We've got habitat loss, we've got climate change, we've got pesticide use, we've got all of these things going on. And the other thing to consider is whether this could be just a natural population variation, because insect populations do undergo cycles of sort of boom and bust, as other species do. But this is far too extreme for that. The magnitude of this is just too great for normal population cycles. Once you see 100-fold reduction in a species, then this is something serious. And of course, spiders are only one of the predators that rely on these flying insects. We've got bats, insectivorous birds. The wrens are going all over my garden. The wrens have a nest in the ivy at the bottom of my garden at the moment. They're going all over my garden hunting for spiders. But of course, all birds are looking for insects to feed their fledglings on at the moment. Bats will be severely impacted. Frogs, swifts, lizards, anything you mention. So this is looking like very bad news indeed. And I sit here in the middle of the coronavirus crisis wishing that I could give you sort of nice fluffy ecological news, but frankly it's quite hard to find that news at the moment. So instead of that, I think we need to look at the positives, and the positives are, well, what can you do about it? And here's how you can help. You can help us get more data about garden spiders, because I think even though the numbers may have declined, garden spiders are undoubtedly reducing in numbers. And the more records we have, the better place we are to monitor what is going on. Now, from casual observations, people spotting spiders in their garden, for example, it is difficult to draw too many conclusions, but nevertheless, the more data we've got, the better the position we're in. So this is the garden spider. This is a female garden spider on her orb web, and this spider has this cross pattern on the upper surface of its abdomen. So what we really need to be able to identify this spider is a nice photograph of the upper surface of the spider. Now, that's not always difficult to do, not always easy to do, rather. If the spider's in a confined space and it's facing away from you, you might only be able to photograph the underside. But there are some other features. You see the mature specimens of this species have these strongly annulated banded legs, so that's also useful as well. But if you possibly can take a picture of the upper side, then please do that, and then submit your records. The other thing that you may see, and this has happened within the last 24 hours, we've had a large number of records submitted to NatureSpot of these hatchling spiderlings of this species, Araneus diadematus, and these are quite characteristic with the black patch on the abdomen. There are one or two species that they could be confused with. But I was out on my walk yesterday, and I made my first record of this species this year. And we've also had a lot of others submitted in the last 24 hours. And there's a nice little trick you can play on these. It's not too cruel. If you blow gently on them, and I do mean gently, then this is what happens. They will start. There we go. I've blown on them and they scatter in all directions. And if you wait a minute or two, they will come back together in a group until they get a bit older, in which case they become antisocial and they don't like each other, at which point they don't come back together again. And that's a mechanism to prevent them eating each other. You can see the adult spiders, but you can, and these are the adults, the adult female and the youngsters. But the other thing that you might find is a male, and the males do look quite different. When you look closely, there is the cross pattern on the abdomen, but they look much slimmer. They're a very different shape. But if you start looking closely, you can see the annulated legs, and you can see the cross on the abdomen. So you should be able to recognize one of these. The males appear later in the season. There are some other species that need to be separated. Now, we would like people to record all spiders, not just garden spiders, but just to help you identify them. This is one you could get confused with. This is the walnut orb weaver. This spider builds an orb web. You might think at first sight similar in appearance. They tend to be darker in color. They have this marking, although around the edge, although you can see that's quite variable. Sometimes it's quite pale, and these spiders tend to be nocturnal. You don't tend to see them during the daytime. You do see garden spiders on their webs at night, but the walnut spider tends to be nocturnal. The other thing you might possibly find is the so-called bridge spider, Lirinoides scopularius, and this spider tends to like man-made structures. The reason it's called the bridge spider is because it tends to build on railings and bridges and things like that. So you might come across this near houses. One of the things that the authors did notice was that the decline in garden spiders in the Swiss study seemed to be paralleled by a rise in the numbers of this species. And they speculated that that might be because these spiders build their webs on man-made structures. They might be taking advantages of insects which are attracted to lights at night time. So lights on bridges, things like that, things like moths and other insects which are attracted by light. You know, if you go out at night, if you run a moth trap, there'll be a whole cloud of midges flying around. That would be a real feast for this spider. The other thing you might possibly get confused with is the missing sector orb weaver, Zygelia exnortata. This thing is sometimes called the window frame spider. Its natural habitat seems to be UPVC windows, seems to like those above all others. We don't know why, but that's where it's happy. So you will see these around houses. They're quite different, really, quite different looking to the garden spider, and you're unlikely to get confused with these. If you want more information, if you want to look at the other possibilities, you can see all the orb weavers that from Leicestershire and Rutland together in the NatureSpot gallery. If you go to this address, you'll be able to see them all, and others that I haven't talked about. I've just talked about the species that you might be most likely to confuse with garden spiders. So what we would like you to do is not just for the next week, but generally for as long as you can, to record spiders for us, because as I've said, the more data we have, the more likely it is that we are going to be able to draw some conclusions on what is happening to the garden spider and indeed other species. So if you're in Leicestershire and Rutland, we would like you to submit your data to NatureSpot, www.naturespot.org.uk. And that's where you submit your records, and they will be examined by experts and verified, or if you've misidentified, we will advise you on that. If you're not in Leicestershire and Rutland, we only take records from Leicestershire and Rutland because that's our remit. If you're from anywhere else in the UK, can you please submit your records to iRecord, brcacuk/iRecord, and that will collect records from anywhere else in the country. If you're on NatureSpot, you'll be able to use our so-called RAG ratings, red, amber, green. So green means the species is easy to identify, and you really would have to work very hard to confuse it with anything else. Amber means that you should be able to identify it from a photograph or by looking at it in the field, but you could confuse it with similar species. Red means a species is very difficult to identify, and generally speaking, a photograph alone is not sufficient to identify this species. You would need something like examining it with a hand lens or a microscope or something like that. But certainly the garden spider is one of our green light species, so you shouldn't have any problems identifying that. And if you do, just ask us for advice. So just before I finish, one more thing I want to say before I ask for questions is we've got another NatureSpot Live event coming up in 2 weeks. We have a talk on plants called Ferns for Fanatics, and that's going to be presented by Jeffrey Hall, who's one of our county recorders for flowering plants and indeed for ferns. So come and hear about ferns from one of the county's experts, and that's at 7 p.m. on Saturday the 23rd of May. If you're interested in that, if you would like to register for that talk, then please do so. Please tell your friends about it. And we would hope to see you there. So that is me done talking, and now I am hoping that you will do some talking. Are there any questions I can help anyone with? You can either wave your hand or use the tool at the bottom of the chat box to raise your hand virtually, as it were, and we'll go around. Any questions from anyone? I've told you more than you wanted to know about spiders. Janet. Janet,
Hi. It's not a question. I just want to say thank you very much. It was really interesting, and I thought it worked very well. So thank you. Really, that was all.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it worked very well. I'm also relieved it worked very well. Sue's got a question.
Would it be useful to try and collect any quantitative data, Alan? The paper you quoted from talked about a sort of transect. One could easily set one up around your garden and try and, over time, maybe over years, see if there is a decline in our gardens.
Yeah, well, absolutely. There are relatively few insect recording schemes that collect structured data. And there are reasons for that. If you look at what ornithologists do, for example, there are quite a lot of structured surveys whereby the data is collected following a strict protocol, meaning that it is possible to make these comparisons between one data set and another data set. So, for example, doing a longitudinal survey over a number of years. Part of the reason for that is because dare I say it, I'm sorry, ornithologist, I like birds, honestly I do, but birds are quite easy to identify compared with most insects. You know, I'm not sure how you would produce a structured data set for money spiders, for example. You could do it, but what you can't do it is you can't just do it by going out with a pair of binoculars and saying, oh yes, that's Tenuiphantes tenuis. You know, you have to come home, you have to put them under the microscope, you have to dissect them sometimes. The masters of doing this in the insect field are butterfly conservation. And they record using this same transect methodology. The idea being that people follow a set route, and there are rules how far away from your route you're allowed to record. You have to do it at a certain time of day, at a certain frequency, and so on and so forth. But it's very difficult to get people who are sufficiently dedicated to do that. And the problem we have at the moment, I think, with the crisis in the decline of insect numbers is by the time we have generated those data sets, you know, it's going to take us 20 years. And by that time, you know, it's potentially too late. So it would be great. I think setting up a transect in your garden is probably not on because unless you've got a very large garden indeed. But I mean, if you've got an area near, if there's a footpath near your house or anything like that, you could certainly do it. But again, unless we have these year-on-year studies that people are prepared to commit to long term, the data is of limited value. So what I'm suggesting at the moment, and if anybody wants to set one of those up, by all means do. But I think, you know, at the moment it's just mass observation that's going to be useful for us. There are statistical tools you can use on unstructured data sets for mass observations to try and draw wider conclusions, and that's probably the situation we're in with most insect groups at the moment.